Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 851, and today is November 6th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to get into on today's show. First, want to remind people to share all my work. The best place to find it is on my Twitter handle, at KyleAnzalone_. I, of course, write at the Libertarian Institute, JudgeNap.com, and Antiwar.com. And then I do this show and the Kyle Anzalone show. Everything on my Twitter handle, all the links in the show notes page for this episode. If you can, make sure you're following me on Twitter and you're subscribed to this show and the Kyle Anzalone show. All right, let's do it. First article up here today. I wrote this one on November 3rd for the Institute. Trump administration developing plans to send soldiers conduct CIA operations in Mexico. So, this was a report from NBC News. Haven't seen a whole lot of denials from the administration, so I'm guessing that it is correct. They say Trump hasn't made a decision on this, but they're drawing up plans that will send U.S. Special Operation Forces and CIA officials into Venezuela. The special operations into Mexico. We'll talk about Venezuela next. The special operations forces will be under the command and be conducting operations with the CIA. They say the DOD, or the DOW now, the Department of War, will likely be conducting airstrikes in Mexico against alleged cartel targets. Now, I imagine this has a fairly complicated bar to clear with the Mexican government still. I would suspect that the Mexican government doesn't want the CIA and Special Operations Forces conducting drone strikes in Mexican territory. They may be willing to essentially talk to the CIA and get a list of targets from the CIA and then go hit those targets with Mexican military officials or with Mexican military forces. But I don't think they're going to, and they may be even okay with the CIA conducting some covert operations in Mexico as long as it doesn't make the news, right? The CIA wants to go in and take out a suspected cartel hub or, do something else that's completely covert. The Mexican government might not mind that so much. I think they're mostly concerned about the things that become public. Likewise, they might not even mind if the Special Operations Forces, in conjunction with the Mexican military, conducted a raid or two within Mexican territory. The thing that I think is really going to cross the line for the Mexican government is the U.S. overtly carrying out airstrikes, drone strikes, inside Mexican territory, because inevitably, we've seen this all over the world. Even when the targeting and intelligence is at its best, they still end up killing civilians and innocent people. And, even if it's the wife and children of cartel members, or even if the cartel is operating in an apartment building and they're, the West will say the U.S. will say they're using the people in that building as human shields, it's going to be completely intolerable for the Mexican people and the Mexican government for the U.S. military to be overtly killing civilians in Mexico. So I think this is going to face a lot of opposition in Mexico City. That doesn't mean that this won't happen. I do suspect that it won't be very public if the U.S. is doing any kind of real operations inside of Mexico because of the opposition from the Mexican government and the Mexican people. On top of that, from the perspective of an American citizen, I would much prefer that if we're going to do anything at all, that we are just passing the intelligence on to the Mexicans and letting them do this. And the number one reason for that is if the U.S. starts killing large members of Mexican cartels, the Mexican cartels might respond by killing Americans. And sure, it may be Americans inside Mexico, at least at first. They would be the easiest targets. And even then, it might be start off with kidnappings and things like this. Maybe they even kidnap some Americans. They place them around high-level members of the cartel to effectively act as human shields for the cartel leadership. But we could also see asymmetric-style attacks, terrorism-style attacks inside of American cities. These, cartels have a presence here. Certainly, they have a lot of drug smuggling routes. They could certainly get, I'm sure, if they're getting as much drugs and people over the border through, human and drug trafficking that they're getting, they would be able to get other items as well, guns, explosives, other kinds of weapons. And hell, I mean, you don't even have to get that inside of Mexico and get smuggled over the border. You can always obtain that stuff inside the United States, or, people rent U-Haul trucks, right? There's so many ways to conduct these asymmetric style attacks. And while I hate the narco terrorism label for the terrorist groups, because it's this, linkage with the war on terror and basically, comparing these people to jihadists, which I don't think really works 90% of the time. They're not doing business with the jihadists. They're not linked to the jihadists. They are as cruel as the Islamic State, when we're talking about beheadings and mass killings and just indiscriminate killings, willing to kill civilians, children, women, things like that. These cartels are willing to do that. And so don't think that there's like some moral standard they won't cross where, they won't run a truck through a crowded New Year's Eve party or something like that, right? Like there's a lot of risk to this, and it seems absolutely foolish. So I'm really hoping this one doesn't happen. I'm hoping that Venezuela doesn't happen too. I do think going after the Mexican cartels would be a bigger issue. All right, so this story I think is really important. Trump admin briefs select members of Congress on strikes in Latin America. I wrote this one up for JudgeNap.com. And so as the Trump administration has continued to strike boats in the Caribbean, they started in the beginning of September, so we're about 2 months in now. They've admitted to destroying at least 16 vessels and killing over 60 people. So just quick math in my head here, that's about two strikes that they're conducting every week, and I would guess that's about 8 or 9 people that they're killing every single week in Latin America. The rate of the killing, but particularly the stories coming out suggesting that this is soon going to extend to land strikes inside of Venezuela. I've been reporting on this in antiwar.com and other places. That what they're doing, it seems to be, ready to go to a full-on war with Venezuela. And so this has finally, after months, really, we're talking months here. You stretch all the way back to the beginning of the Trump administration. I was warning about this, but specifically this summer when Marco Rubio designated Cartel de los Soles, which is a fiction, and Tren de Aragua, TDA, which is a cartel that exists, but Maduro isn't the head of it as the U.S. claims. But when the U.S. government listed those cartels as terrorist organizations and claimed that Maduro was the leader of those cartels, I was warning then that they're getting ready to go to war in Venezuela. They're getting ready to do a regime change in Venezuela. And so finally, Congress is taking notice. Now, up until this point, the Trump administration has essentially had a policy of, we're not going to tell you about what we're doing here. We don't have to tell you about what we're doing here. We don't have to explain not only do we not have to explain how in the hell a constitution that delegates war-making authorities to the Congress could allow the Trump administration to go to war first, with these cartels in international waters in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, but also going in directly against Venezuela. How the hell that could possibly ever work? And so we've seen some discussion about this. In fact, Rand Paul, Tim Kaine, and I think Adam Schiff are the co-sponsors of this War Powers Resolution that's going to be voted on in the Senate today, that is Thursday, that would look to constrain the Trump administration and prevent them from going about this. Now, the problem with this War Powers Resolution is even if it does pass, then it has to get past the House. then the president's going to veto it. And I don't think they're going to be able to get the 16 or 17 Republicans needed to flip to override the president's veto in the Senate. Right now, it looks like at best, if all the Democrats vote against this, which I'm not, or vote for the War Powers Resolution, which I'm not sure they will have Rand Paul and Murkowski, which I guess would give them a majority. And then there's reportedly 4 or 5 other Republican senators who are questioning voting for that resolution. So we're talking at most 55, 56 Republicans that would potentially be willing to vote for it. It simply won't be enough to override the president's veto. But if the Senate does pass this, it's obviously going to create problems and turn up the kind of heat on the Trump administration to explain what they're doing here and then go to Congress and get an actual authorization to go to war with Venezuela. I'm sure that's not going to be a declaration of war, but maybe some kind of AUMF or vague language inserted into the National Defense Authorization Act that would make funds available to the president to combat cartels in Latin America. Like some kind of legislative action that the White House could point to and say, Congress did that, giving us the authority to go to war. So what happened was Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, and the Secretary of War went to Congress, and they just briefed a select number of members of the House and Senate. I think it was the leadership of both parties. So, it's going to be Chuck Schumer, John Thune, Mike Johnson, Hakeem Jeffries, and then the leaders of some of the committees. I think the Foreign Affairs, Military, and Intelligence committees. So very few members of Congress get these briefings. And from what I understand, they didn't say a whole lot in these briefings beyond what has already been made public, which is also not very much. So the Trump administration is looking here to take us to a war without explaining at all to the American people what their legal justification for that conflict is. Highly concerning and disturbing that we're going in this direction. So we'll see what happens on this vote. We'll have more updates next week. I do want to say I was very concerned that the strikes in Venezuela will begin any time now, really. I did see that the aircraft carrier that they're planning on sending to the Caribbean is just now leaving the Mediterranean. So I would guess at least we have until that aircraft carrier reaches the Caribbean, and then probably a couple of days for the logistics to all get in place and things like that before any kind of strikes would begin. So not sure if it would happen this weekend, next weekend, sometime around Thanksgiving would be like kind of the time I'm going to start really worrying about us going to war in Venezuela. All right, next up here, this is one I wrote for the Institute on November 3rd. Zelensky says Ukraine received more Patriot systems, and he didn't say how many, but he said Germany fulfilled their promise to provide Ukraine with Patriot systems, and Germany had previously said that they were going to give Ukraine 2. So I would assume that Ukraine got 2. They could have revised that and only given them 1. I don't know for sure, but that's my speculation there. Now, one of the important things I want to highlight here is the Patriot systems are becoming less and less and less and less effective. Right now, they have a 6% hit rate, and as Daryl Cooper explained to me on the Kyle Anzalone show, they want to have a 200% hit rate. So if the Patriot missiles had a 100% interception rate, they would fire 2 of them just in case something happened. That way they know they're going to take it down. 25% interception rate, you're firing 8. They have a 6% interception rate, so they would be firing in over the 30s to be fairly confident that they're going to be able to shoot down the incoming missile. That's just making these systems almost entirely ineffective and certainly not cost effective. The Russian missiles cost in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The Patriot interceptors cost, I think, between $1 and $4 million, depending on the variant of it. My guess is Ukraine is getting the older and the cheaper variants. They're not getting the brand new Pat 3 variant of the Patriot interceptor. And so, they're spending tens of millions of dollars to shoot down every single Russian incoming missile that's costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. And maybe even more important than the price point is Russia could produce the missiles a lot faster than the U.S. could produce the Patriot interceptors. And so Ukraine is in real trouble here. Another big concern, Putin orders militaries to submit proposals for testing nuclear weapons. This is a response to Donald Trump's Truth Social post last week, where he said that he ordered the Department of War to prepare for testing a nuclear weapon. This is a big deal. I am not somebody who's concerned about climate change. I wouldn't really consider myself an environmentalist. That being said, I do see major impacts on the environment if we start conducting nuclear weapons testing again. This is really, really, really bad. One of the really important international agreements is the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which the U.S. and Russia have both signed, and they both observe it, but they do not actually have not ratified it. And so I think both countries are in a position where they could very quickly exit that treaty. And of course, if they do, they're putting us all at risk of seeing nuclear weapons testing again, which we know would be an absolute catastrophe, and also ramp up the nuclear tensions between the two countries that are already too high. Now, another point to all of this is it's actually going to be a disadvantage for the United States to do this. Of all the countries that have tested nuclear weapons, I think the USSR has tested the most, but the US was second on that list. And, China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, Israel, all being significantly behind. And so because of that, and because of the nuclear testing during the Cold War, the U.S. actually collected the best data on it. So, when they would do little things to the bombs, they would then, say, these are the changes we made. They test the weapon, and they would be able to compare the two nuclear explosions. And so now, rather than actually detonating nuclear weapons for testing, they just run computer models to simulate, okay, if we change this or that or the other thing, then this is going to be the result. And because the US has the best data, we get the best results from our computer models. And so if everybody starts testing nuclear weapons, particularly with, the modern instruments they're going to have to calculate and determine the size of the nuclear explosion and all the other elements that are important, China, Russia, India, Pakistan, maybe not North Korea, Israel, would all be able to make, potential large gains on the United States and the data gap that we have on nuclear weapons explosions. And so it would ultimately end up being a loss for the United States. Now, I did read that, and I think this would be probably the first step the United States would take, is I think it's called a subcritical nuclear detonation, where I believe the atom doesn't actually split. And so you don't have like the radioactive nuclear explosion, but you have it just up until that limit. A few years ago, I read an article, and I guess they call this tickling the dragon's tail. Absolutely insane. And so I'm worried that they're going to take that step. And whatever the United States does, Russia will reciprocate. And look, maybe Russia will see Donald Trump's statement here as a green light to test a nuclear weapon, right? We're not going to wait for the U.S. to do it first. We know that there's this data gap between the two countries, and Trump has given us an opportunity to bridge that a little bit. Even if the United States tests a nuclear weapon after us, we're not so concerned about that because we're going to get a bunch of really good data from it. And the United States is only going to get a marginal amount of new good data from it. And that is maybe going to be the Russian calculation. You don't know what decision that they're going to make in the Kremlin. So very concerning here, something we'll probably be talking about in the weeks to come. All right, North Korea rules out talks with the U.S. after latest round of sanctions. I wrote this one for JudgeNap.com on November 5th. And, kind of recapping the events of the past 2 weeks, as Trump is, I believe, traveling to Asia for his tour. He leans out the door on Air Force One and tells reporters, yeah, I'd really like to meet Kim Jong-un while I'm in Asia. If anybody knows Kim, send him a message. Let him know that I wanted to speak with him, which I think was probably a generally poor way to handle the situation. I think the North Koreans would have preferred, reach out through bat channels, which maybe they're ignoring, and try to figure out if any kind of deal or conversation made sense at this point in time. While I would always be an advocate for talking, if you do know that you have a very firm disagreement with somebody on a certain issue, sometimes it's better just not to talk to that person, right? If that issue has to come up, and you could just, not be an active hostile conflict and just like I had this simmering issue on the back burner. So maybe in this case, it's actually better not to talk. I'm not so sure. Trump made that overture again while in Asia. Again, I thought it was kind of foolish for him to do this because it didn't seem like there would really be enough time to set up the summit. Even if North Korea responded positively to it, I don't think they're like logistically, the time-wise, figuring out the travel plans and things like that, what they're going to meet, what they're going to talk about, the photo ops, who's going to attend from each side. All these details take time to work out to have state-level visits between two leaders, particularly of rival nations like the United States and North Korea. It'd be one thing for Keir Starmer or Benjamin Netanyahu to come to the United States on short notice, or for Trump to meet with either of those leaders on shorter notice. It's a completely different story when we're talking about the North Koreans or someone else. Now, then after Trump, doesn't get a response for the North Koreans, he leaves Asia. The U.S. slapped some new sanctions on the North Koreans and also submit a proposal to the United Nations to sanction a bunch of ships that it claims are transiting North Korean goods to China. So North Korea looked at this and they said, well, this is all the proof that we need that the Trump administration has not abandoned the hostile policies. I think the way they word it is actually somewhat important. They say the new administration has imposed extensive sanctions, and it shows that this is, the same kind of policy that Washington has always had. So I think for the North Koreans that, this was a real sign that nothing is changing, that no corner is being turned now that Joe Biden is out of office, or whoever was running his foreign policy is out of office and Trump is in. This seems to be an indication to the North Koreans that, hey, we are actually facing with the same thing, and so we're going to continue to move forward with our same policy. And that North Korean policy, by the way, is that they're not going to meet with the Americans unless Washington takes denuclearization off the table. All right, so catch you up on this story here. If you remember, it came out in the summer of 2024 that Israeli prison guards had raped a Palestinian man in the Sid Tamin detention facility. And so kind of the sequence of events here, reports that it happened came out. The Israeli, I want to say Justice Department, but it might have even just been the military police, go in and arrest the alleged perpetrators. A mob forms outside the facility, and that mob actually breaks into the facility with the goal not of holding those men accountable, but freeing them, because they said nothing wrong here. Nothing, they didn't do anything wrong. They shouldn't be punished for this. So in response to that, a video is leaked of the abuse. And it's horrible, it's graphic. And then don't hear anything about it for a long time. There's supposed to be like a trial going on. I think they initially arrested 11 and then end up charging 5 members of the IDF with the sexual abuse, beating, torture of this Palestinian detainee. But they're out of jail. They're not in jail. They're out. They're giving press conferences, giving statements occasionally. But generally speaking, there hasn't been a lot of conversation about this story until a couple weeks ago when the military advocate general of the IDF resigns. And in her resignation letter, she explains that she authorized the leak of that video. And I think it's important to note here that she authorized the leak of that video, not necessarily to expose the crime, but just to show the Israeli people that there was a serious crime committed, because her prosecutors and people in her office were getting tons and tons and tons of threats for trying to prosecute the soldiers. Maybe it had that effect. I don't know Israeli society well enough to say. Netanyahu comes out and he very explicitly says that this event was a PR attack on Israel, the most significant PR attack that Israel has ever sustained. And he's not talking about the rape of the Palestinian man. He's talking about the release of the video. And I think that's a very telling insight and really important to note that, you know, this is the situation with Israeli society right now, that when they rape a Palestinian, the problem isn't that a Palestinian man was raped. The problem is the public found out about it. That people know about, you know, the murder of Palestinians in Gaza isn't the problem. The problem is that people are seeing the videos. That's the Israeli perspective on all of this. Now, I guess one further update here. A journalist was actually able to get a hold of, I think he's for with the Center for European Policy Research or something like that. And he actually was able to speak with the Palestinian man who was the victim of this rape. He was released without trial or charges 3 weeks ago. So he's innocent, you know, innocent innocent Palestinian man raped in an Israeli prison. And we shouldn't be surprised. Israeli IDF data shows that only 1 in 4 of the people that they hold in detention, Palestinians that they've held in detention facilities since October 7th, 2023, have been members of a militant group. So that means 75% are innocent civilians. And, you know, good chances that he was going to be innocent. Turns out that he is innocent. But on top of that, after the rape, they, I believe, stuck some kind of like electric prod into his anus. He had to have his rectum and colon removed, 20 surgeries. So just to show, this is a horrific level of abuse. They're not, you know, taking some video of some guy getting hit a few times with a stick and claiming it's rape. This is something really, really, really atrocious happened to him. The Palestinian man has not been publicly identified, and he's afraid that the Israelis are going to assassinate him to cover up the stories. And he's probably right about that. So this is just very dark. And of course, the United States is supporting all of it. Next up here, Hamas returns body of last American held in Gaza. So I believe as of this past weekend, there were only 2 Americans that were still bodies who are still held in Gaza by Hamas. Omar Nutra's body was handed over to Israel over the weekend, and then Itla Chen was returned to Israel on Tuesday. And these were both members of the IDF. A lot of times when the hostages get discussed, they make it out to be that these were people who were sleeping in their beds, who were at home, or at the Nova Music Festival when they were taken. And there were certainly people who do fall into that category who were hostages held by Hamas in Gaza. But some of them were also prisoners of war. And that's important here. Right, important thing to note. All right, next up, food deliveries to Gaza remain insufficient. So at this point, Hamas has released the 20 living Israeli captives. I believe we're now up to 21 or 22 of the remains of Israeli captives have been returned to Israel. And that's actually more than I thought that they were going to be able to return. I was reading reports, even from Israeli media at the start of the ceasefire, saying that Hamas only knew the locations of 14 or 15 bodies. So the fact that they've been able to recover 22 within a month is actually somewhat surprising to me. But Israel has claimed that they're not releasing the bodies fast enough, and this is a ceasefire violation. I really don't think it's a ceasefire violation if you look at the ceasefire, because when it was signed, the parties, at least the Hamas parties, their mediators, but also the United States, said that the recovery of the bodies is going to take some time. Israel just allowed the Egyptian team with the demolitions, not demolitions, debris clearing equipment into Gaza for the first time about 2 weeks ago now. So for most of the ceasefire period, people were just digging with what was available: hands, shovels, human power, right? It's only now that they're getting in the equipment to clear the debris. And of course, some of these are in tunnels, so I'm sure that it requires not only clearing the debris, but also kind of reinforcing and repairing the tunnels, at least in a temporary measure, in order for the teams to be able to get further down the tunnels to recover the bodies. Of course, these, Egyptian teams, they don't want the tunnel collapsing and them to end up their bodies being added to the people killed in Gaza, right? So they've released quite a few bodies, but Israel is claiming this is a ceasefire violation, and they're restricting aid deliveries into Gaza. Humanitarian organizations are saying, look, the conditions aren't improving. People aren't maybe actively starving to death, but the hunger crisis has largely not subsided in Gaza. And Israel agreed to allow 600 aid trucks into Gaza every single day. The highest number they've allowed in so far is 200 on a single day. This is not a good situation for the Palestinians. Elsewhere on the ceasefire, the officials are saying that the medical shortages still exist and the displacement crisis still exists. One of the big challenges the Palestinians face is that they're living in tents and overcrowded and damaged shelters. So there's not good protection from the elements, and winter is coming up. So rather than the ceasefire really providing any kind of humanitarian relief for the Palestinian people of Gaza, it hasn't happened. Next up here, just want to mention this one quickly. U.S. asked UN to remove sanctions on Syrian leader Jolani before the former al-Qaeda commander visits the White House. So the U.S. has brought a resolution to the UN Security Council that will remove sanctions on Syrian leader Abu Mohammed al-Jolani and one of his top deputies. Both are veterans of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Both were involved with the Islamic State and the al-Nusra Front. The al-Nusra Front was al-Qaeda's Syria affiliate. They were, of course, Jolani led, and the other guy was the deputy commander of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which was HTS after it rebranded from al-Qaeda but retained the jihadist ideology. And since taking power in Syria, rather than being good stewards of power, they have oversaw massacres of ethnic minorities in Syria. And the U.S. looks at all of this, asked the UN to remove sanctions on Jolani, and is bringing him to the White House on Monday. All right, last up here, Ayatollah. Iran cannot talk with U.S. while it bats Israel. And so Iran gave a pretty bleak statement on the future of potential negotiations between Washington and Tehran, and basically said, hey, we're not prepared to talk unless you abandon your support for Israel and your hostile position against the Iranians. Additionally, the Iranian president said that Iran was planning to rebuild its nuclear program. Still, the U.S. has said that if Iran doesn't engage in talks, that if Tehran rebuilds its nuclear program, then we're going back to war with the Iranians. And the U.S. really isn't presenting any conditions or terms to the Iranians to foster a situation where the Iranians would agree to maybe limit the rebuilding of some of their nuclear facilities, or would agree to engage in talks with the U.S. at all with their other policy actions in the Middle East. All right, that'll do it for the show today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I will be back with another show of Conflicts of Interest on Monday, and I will have another episode of the Kyle Anzalone Show later today. Make sure you check it out. Thanks, everyone.